war breaks out again. Missiles streak across an old sky, slicing through rooftops that once belonged to someone. A child falls face first in the rubble, still clutching a torn piece of cloth in his hand. Across the street, a soldier stands motionless in the wail of sirens, eyes hollow and unblinking, as if even he no longer knows what he's supposed to protect. They don't know each other, yet the blood in their veins once came from the same father. Unbelievable, perhaps, but that's exactly what the Bible recorded. Not at the end, but in the very beginning. One father, named Abraham, 2 sons, born of 2 different women. One was Ishmael, the son of the desert, cast out and called the father of the Arab peoples. One was Isaac, the son of promise, kept near and known as the root of the Jewish nation. From those 2 children, a separation began, not with swords, but with a wound buried deep in the heart. That wound has lasted for thousands of years, and even now, it still bleeds. You think this is politics? A land dispute? No. This is a fracture in a family turned into a chasm between nations. And only one book saw it all coming, long before the war ever began. The Bible. The origin of the rift. It didn't begin with booming bombs or stray bullets tearing through the air, but with an invisible rift, slowly forming within the very heart of a family. This is the story of a husband, a wife, and a servant girl. 3 individuals whose interwoven hopes, fears, and destinies inadvertently sowed the seeds for a conflict that would last for millennia. Abraham, a man of profound faith, had received a grand promise from the Almighty that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through them, all nations on earth would be blessed. A promise of cosmic proportions. Yet it collided with a harsh reality. Abraham was old, and his wife, Sarah, remained barren, the chance of motherhood seemingly gone forever. Years passed in heavy silence, marked only by the sighs of waiting and the gnawing despair. Sarah, unable to bear the suffocating quiet of time, or perhaps the weight of a promise yet unfulfilled, made a bitter decision of her own. She gave her servant, Hagar, to Abraham to bear a child on her behalf, a custom of the era, but one that contained the complexities of human emotion and the seeds of future unhappiness. Abraham, in his desperation, or perhaps out of a desire to see God's promise fulfilled at any cost, accepted. Hagar conceived. But in this home, which seemingly should have been filled with joy, the language of love was slowly replaced by a cold jealousy. Sarah's gaze now saw Hagar not merely as a servant, but as a rival. Someone who had taken what she most desperately longed for. Hearts began to fracture, not from an external enemy, but from within, from the very desires and weaknesses of their own beings. When Hagar gave birth to a son, she named him Ishmael. The boy grew up not in the embrace of a complete, warm family, but with the gaze of one once rejected, deeply etched with the pain of the wilderness. Although Abraham's firstborn, Ishmael carried within him the sorrow of the desert, a deep melancholy about his uncertain status, about not truly belonging. His life was a constant reminder of that initial rift. 14 years later, when Ishmael was already a teenager, a true miracle occurred. Sarah herself, the woman who had seemed utterly hopeless, conceived and bore Isaac. Joy overflowed, yet it was also a bell tolling for a new tragedy. 2 children, sharing one tent, sharing one father, yet their destinies were worlds apart. Isaac was loved unconditionally, the child of the promise, the embodiment of faith and hope. In contrast, Ishmael was gradually seen as a superfluous shadow, an existence that needed to leave to make way for the chosen one. Then, on a fateful day, Sarah forced Abraham to make a cruel decision: drive out Hagar and her son. Those words were like a sharp blade, severing the last bond, filled with immense pain. Abraham, perhaps in obedience to God or under pressure from Sarah, had to comply. With his own hands, he tore his family apart, pushing a part of his own flesh and blood into uncertainty. Hagar embraced her child, stepping into the hopeless desert under the scorching sun, with no water, no path, no glimmer of hope. She placed little Ishmael beneath a withered bush, then sat a distance away, not daring to watch her child gasp for life. The agony of a mother witnessing her child on the brink of death is incomparable. But the faint cries of the child reached the heavens. An angel of God appeared, guiding Hagar to a wellspring in the barren land and making a wondrous promise to Ishmael: I will make him into a great nation. From then on, Ishmael survived, matured, and became the ancestor of the Arab peoples. A promise fulfilled even in rejection. A son driven away, a bloodline severed, yet never forgotten. This was not the end of a family tragedy. This was merely the first crack, the beginning of a destined wall that would one day crumble, dividing an entire world. 2 rivers, 2 destinies, sowing the seeds of conflict. After the tearful upheaval, Ishmael grew up amidst the harsh desert. He became a skilled archer, a free-spirited nomad, adapting to a life of wandering and survival in the wild. Yet, within him, he carried no external scars, but the profound memory of an entire people, a people who would be born from pain and promise. Every step Ishmael took on the hot sand etched a grand promise that he himself would be the father of 12 tribes, the future princes of Arabia, who would dominate a vast land. Meanwhile, not long after, Isaac also grew up in his father's household, enveloped in the warmth and safety of the encampment. He was nurtured not only by love, but by doctrine, becoming the child of the covenant, of destiny, of the first Jewish faith. Isaac's life was intertwined with laws, blessings, and the promise of a nation, a chosen people. And from these 2 children, 2 distinct destinies began to diverge. 2 peoples began to take shape. This division was not by language, but by opposing ancestral histories and memories. 2 root narratives of existence. Ishmael carried a burning desire to prove that he was not abandoned, that his existence was meaningful and valuable, just as God had promised. His life was a journey of self-affirmation. Conversely, Isaac was taught that he was the chosen one, the sole lineage bearing God's promise to humanity, destined to inherit the land and its blessings. Ishmael was forged in the wild freedom, in the harsh struggle for survival in the desert. He learned to trust his instincts, his own strength, and God's will manifested through nature. Isaac, on the other hand, was sheltered within the encampment, amidst the laws and blessings of an organized community. He learned obedience, how to live by divine instruction, and how to trust in God's protection within a defined framework. Notably, the Bible does not record Ishmael and Isaac ever clashing directly in battle or having any personal conflict during their lives. They even buried Abraham together when he died. But in the eyes of their descendants, in the stories passed down through generations, a rift had formed, a crack in perception, in inheritance rights, in perceived superiority. Ishmael fathered 12 sons, and his descendants became powerful nomadic chieftains, spreading across the Arabian Peninsula. They pitched their tents, multiplied, and established vast territories, from mighty Egypt in the west to legendary Babylon in the east. The Arab peoples inherited Ishmael's spirit of freedom and resilience. Meanwhile, Isaac fathered Jacob, who later was renamed Israel, a name carrying the soul of a new nation. From him, the 12 tribes of Israel were born, and they were not merely a collection of tribes, but a people with a chosen destiny, shaping the entire history of the Near East with stories of covenants, laws, and the Messiah. From 2 biological sons, 2 colossal nations were born, and from that point, 2 vast, opposing memories grew in parallel, never to be reconciled again. One memory carried the feeling of exclusion, of being cast out, of being robbed of a rightful role as the firstborn. This is the memory of Ishmael and his descendants, those who constantly had to struggle to assert their existence and rights in their ancestral lands. The other memory overflowed with the belief of being chosen, blessed, and destined to possess the promised land. This is the memory of Isaac and his descendants, those who believed they were the lineage of the covenant, holding a sacred right to the land God had promised. And it was in that very promised land that the conflict began to branch into destiny, transforming into a core question: who is the true heir? Who is the legitimate lineage of the promise? That question isn't confined to ancient texts, nor is it merely a debate among scholars. It has permeated their blood, woven into their dreams, and etched itself into intergenerational wounds of both peoples. One side yearns to reclaim a lost standing, seeking justice for millennia of marginalization. The other steadfastly refuses to share, believing they hold an absolute divine right. From a single family, there are now 2 worlds entirely distinct, with opposing histories, memories, and aspirations. And most tragically, both believe that God is on their side. Generations of conflict, the scars deepen. Generation after generation, the promise transformed into a nation, the nation into a memory, and that memory finally ignited into war. But not a war of bullets and bombs. It became a war of origins, of identity, of the right to belong. The Jewish people endured 400 years of enslavement in Egypt, living in torment, awaiting the day of their liberation. Meanwhile, the Arabs dispersed across the desert, establishing nomadic tribes, flourishing and adaptable amidst vast empires. Moses led the Israelites across the Red Sea, beginning a legendary journey through the desert. They followed a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night, carrying in their hearts the promise of a granted land. Ishmael's descendants, meanwhile, lived on the eastern and southern desert fringes, controlling the vital spice and livestock routes. They had no promise from heaven, but they had their lands, their camels, and the freedom of those who never bowed down. Then Joshua, Moses' successor, led the conquest of Canaan, the Promised Land, now modern-day Israel and Palestine. Every stronghold fell. Every native people pushed back. The promise materialized with blood and sword. Concurrently, the Arab tribes to the south, Edom, Moab, Ammon, distant cousins of Israel, grew increasingly powerful. They never forgot being cast out. They lived nearby, but forever didn't belong. Throughout the era of kings, from Saul to David to Solomon, the Israelites established their nation, built the magnificent temple, and wrote the Holy Scriptures. They believed God chose them, living among other peoples like a radiant lamp in the darkness. The Arabs viewed this with complex eyes, a mix of admiration, skepticism, and a silent tension. They didn't need prophecy, but they knew they also carried Abraham's blood. Then Israel divided into two, north and south, plagued by internal conflict, drifting away from God's laws. And that's when the blade of destiny, wielded by foreign empires, began to descend. Assyria, Babylon, then Persia. Wave after wave of invasion crushed God's people in exile and suffering. The temple was destroyed, sacred texts burned, the nation displaced from their very own promised land. Meanwhile, the Arab tribes remained steadfast in the desert. No empire ever dominated them for too long. Freedom was their proud identity, and that pride was the indestructible legacy Ishmael left behind. Time passed. God remained silent for 400 years between the Old and New Testaments. But that silence was far from empty. It incubated a storm of destiny approaching from both sides. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the land between these two bloodlines, wise men from the east came to worship, bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. No one knows for certain who they were, but many scholars believe they were descendants of the ancient Arab tribes. If true, then right there in that humble manger, two bloodlines collectively knelt before one singular king. But history wasn't as serene as a manger. It moved toward the cross. The Jewish people rejected the Messiah, while the Gentiles, including the Arabs, began to believe. Then came the Roman Empire, followed by the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Once again, Ishmael's powerful descendants recaptured Jerusalem, establishing mighty empires. From this point, the conflict was no longer just a family affair. It became a holy war. Two peoples, two religions, two memories, both fiercely declared, "This is our land." But when both claim it, who will yield? And when both believe God is on their side, who will truly hear God's voice? It's no longer just Ishmael or Isaac. Now it's millions of people bearing the faces of their ancestors, but carrying modern pain. This is no longer an old story. It's an unhealed wound, bleeding from scripture to politics, from the desert to the international stage. And if we don't understand the original wound, then the world will forever bandage the surface without ever reaching the root. The modern era, a cycle of pain. The 20th century dawned with the agony of two worlds, yet it marked a fateful turning point for one people. After millennia of wandering, the Jewish people began to return to the land where their ancestors once lived. Not as conquerors, but as survivors from the crematoria of an earthly hell. The Holocaust, 6 million people systematically murdered, simply for bearing a name, a bloodline, a memory. The world watched in horror. But within that silence of conscience, something profound happened. In 1948, the State of Israel was declared, right on the land Abraham once walked. The Jewish people called it a miracle from God. The Arabs called it an occupation, a humiliation, an indelible loss. Over 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes, becoming refugees in the very land they once called their homeland. That day, Arabs called it Nakba, the catastrophe. Jews called it Independence Day. From then on, it was no longer two brothers estranged. Instead, it was two peoples trapped in hatred, bound by the same piece of land and the same promise. In 1967, Israel emerged victorious from the Six-Day War and captured East Jerusalem. The Holy City became the epicenter of conflict, a place both sides claim as absolutely sacred. On the summit of the Temple Mount, Jews remembered their destroyed temple. Right there, Arab Muslims built the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's 3 holiest sites. Two memories erected on the same stone. Two prayers echoing under the same sky. And it is precisely there that countless clashes erupt. Stones, tear gas, gunshots, and tears, as if ancient prophecy is coming to life. Palestinian children grow up amidst walls, checkpoints, and tear gas. Jewish teenagers mature in the shadows of rockets, sirens, and assault rifles. No one is innocent, but all are trapped. No one is evil, but everyone is hurting. The question is no longer who is right, but who is brave enough to remember they were once brothers. This story isn't just on a map of the Middle East. It resides in the human heart, where memory never dies and pain never forgets. In the book of Isaiah, there is a prophecy that Egypt, Assyria, and Israel will worship together. 3 nations, 3 ancient foes, called my people, my inheritance, and the work of my hands. If the Bible speaks truth, then there is still hope for a reconciliation deeper than bloodlines. But if the Bible is forgotten, then war will keep repeating itself, like a vicious cycle of pain. Today, Israel still exists, thrives, and is strong, but always on the defensive. Palestine still exists, divided, aggrieved, and always living amidst violence and resentment. Each side has its own story, its own losses, its own dead. But the Bible doesn't tell the story by maps, but by bloodlines, by dreams, by forgiveness. If this were merely a land dispute, it could be divided. But if this is a promise, then no one will yield. If these were just two nations, they could negotiate. But if these are two brothers, then something deeper than politics is needed: repentance. We are living in a time the Bible calls the end times. And it is in the Middle East that all prophecies are aligning like the final chess pieces. Many have died to hold a hill of stone. But one person died to break down the wall of hatred between two peoples. That person is named Jesus, born of Abraham's lineage. And his blood flowed amidst the shouts of both sides. He chose no side. He chose peace, but a peace that comes through the cross. The enduring wound, a call to peace. Today, the concrete walls still stand, separating Israel and Palestine. They don't just divide land, they cleave the memories, souls, and futures of two generations. The Jewish people still build, still bear arms, still affirm their claim as the lineage of the promise. The Arabs still resist, still endure pain, still believe they were robbed of what rightfully belonged to them. Every brick, every road, every airstrike is remembered, not just by news reports, but by the graves, diaries, tears, and blood of loved ones. But amidst it all, the Bible remains open, not as an old book, but as a mirror for both peoples to see themselves. When Jesus was crucified, above his head hung the inscription, King of the Jews. Yet it was also he who fled to Egypt, a land of Arab people, as a child. In him, two bloodlines became one. In him is redemption for both sides, the chosen and the outcast. Jesus didn't come to establish a nation. He came to break down the wall of separation between people, between brothers. He carried no sword, yet he was killed like a warrior, not for territory, but for humanity, for all people, regardless of whether their blood belonged to Isaac or Ishmael. Perhaps it's time the world stopped asking who is right and started asking who will be the first to drop the knife. History may not be changed, but memory can be healed if both sides turn back to where the rift began. Not to temples, not to banners, not to maps, but to an ancient tent where a mother wept in the desert and a father stood silently watching his son depart. In that place, war never existed, only hurt, misunderstanding, and two children who never got to grow up together. If Ishmael and Isaac could have embraced, perhaps history would have been written with ink instead of blood. But they didn't embrace, and we, their descendants, continue to live with that deadly silence, one gunshot at a time. Yet, the Bible still says that one day, all nations will bow before one king, not a king of Israel, nor of Palestine, but the King of Peace. He won't reside in tanks or drones. He will reside in the human heart, the last place war hasn't touched. And perhaps then, Ishmael and Isaac will finally smile. No longer the outcast and the chosen, but two brothers walking beyond the curse. True peace isn't a treaty. It's forgiveness deeper than pain, a remembrance no longer stained with blood. You can choose a side, or you can choose truth, the truth only the Bible dares to fully expose. Not to condemn, but to heal. Not to divide, but to remind you are brothers. The war will continue. But if one person listens, just one, and remembers the source, then history has already changed. This story doesn't end with fireworks or declarations. It ends with a pregnant pause, where each person asks themselves, if they are brothers, then who am I in this story?